Well now, a huge welcome to you to my channel, The Magic of Java. This is my fourth book in the series, and this is called The Phoenix and the Creatures of Darkness. Now I want to emphasise that this is a novel, and only a novel. Yes, it is based on real people, even some celebrities, and real events. But I need to apologise to you if you feel you've identified yourself, because that was never my intention. The intention is for this simply to be a novel, an entertainment for you. Further revelations and karma. Looking at my past 3 episodes, it's obvious that I've provided a journal of my feelings and awakening. I started by accepting my responsibility for the destruction of whom I believed to be my UK family, questioning what I might have done better. There's a great deal of hurt and guilt within me. Maybe that's the true reason why I've given away so much of my money. But slowly I began to realise just how much I had been manipulated, while still accepting some blame. Now I find that all these issues that have plagued my thinking are classic signs of psychopathic manipulation, including my reaction to them. Even when I accepted how manipulated I'd been, I still sought answers, not least, why me? The very fact that I've chronicled my feelings and events in these episodes is indicative that I'm still suffering from psychopathic abuse. That in writing them down, I'm seeking to absolve myself and expose the wrongdoing that has been done to me. But I'm beginning to understand that this is all about karma. Yes, there is a meaning to life, and for me it's about learning to deal with the psychopath and narcissist. Can I forgive myself and accept what the world has in store for me? Well, it's difficult in these difficult times. But what stake do I really have in the outcomes? I've learned to dispense with those areas of my life which have caused me pain, and now is the time to put into practice. Maybe this includes to stop being dragged into world events. Another effect of my abuse was the effect it had on my morals, as I was encouraged to take moral relativism to its limits. I was oblivious to these simply being devices to manipulate me. Fortunately, my conversion to Islam provided me with a sharp re-evaluation of these values. But isn't moral relativism indicative of the degree to which psychopathy has completely infiltrated our every social interaction, as they actually see the world in terms of good and evil? But it goes further than this. In previous episodes, I have chronicled the chipping away at my morals when faced with real-world situations. But were these not also examples of narcissism in the world? The narcissist influences our thinking and behaviour until we begin to believe that it only matters if you get caught, and that the law does not apply to me. So eventually my worldview became that of the narcissist, rather than from the scriptures that I was taught as a child. It seems to me that in any system, narcissists and psychopaths rise to the top because they break, then rig the rules. So we need to keep reinventing systems and rules in order to curtail their power. But we could organise society in another way, based on respect for God's love and his or her abundance. Every once I have finally forgiven myself, there will be a lasting effect, and that is that I will always overanalyse every reaction and discussion, always be on my guard for the hidden agenda. This leads me to making mistakes, which became all too apparent within the latter years of my business in the UK, and indeed could this be why I initially handled the black magic and Maddie's reactions so badly? It seems to me that the lasting effects of the current crisis, trust has been completely destroyed and the only people to regain some dignity and cohesion is by returning to self-reliance and community. I appeared to incense an American YouTuber based in Bali. He'd recently bought a one-bedroom flat in Ubud and was very pleased with himself and the price he'd paid for it. I was immediately worried for him. The price did not seem to be at all good, even though I have no knowledge of the costs in Ubud. But what really concerned me, that he was talking about it as though it was a good investment, when I doubted that he could hold the land title. I gently tried to let him know, but to my surprise he posted another video, clearly completely affronted by my comments. I posted another comment as a gesture of my goodwill, but nothing made sense to me. After doing some work, I found that far from being a purchaser, he was actually a developer. No wonder he was so annoyed. I'd exposed his subterfuge. Not wanting to harm his business any more than I already had, I deleted my comments, included some unrelated from the past. So once again I've come across another Westerner intent on defrauding fellow Westerners here in Indonesia. Probably even yet another psychopath. I recall when I was last in Ubud some 10 years ago with Maddie, and we went into an Australian bar that Kane recommended on TripAdvisor, and came across an American who I immediately took a dislike to. One often comes across know-it-all expats when visiting those places where they've chosen to live, but I wonder if he was one and the same as my property developer. People with opinions just go around bothering one another. Buddha. I explored a little further to find that Bali is full of ridiculously priced properties aimed at expats, some even claiming real estate to be more valuable than New York, all being somewhat aggressively sold, rather like timeshare in Florida or Tenerife. During our last visit to Sanur, Maddie and I had lunch in a cafe that was extremely highly rated on TripAdvisor. That was owned by a man from Boston and his Chinese-Indonesian wife. My burger was okay, not the wonderful signature dish it was purported to be on TripAdvisor, but okay for a moderately priced cafe. I emphasised moderate, as it certainly wasn't cheap. But Maddie's Sunday dishes were not acceptable. The rice was obviously from the previous day and warmed up. Maddie couldn't eat it. When I reviewed the restaurant on TripAdvisor, I was honest, even generous. I realised that like so many properties in Bali, the rental costs meant that few businesses could make a living, emphasising that this was no excuse for not serving fresh food. Again, the owner was incensed, even claiming that we'd enjoyed the food so much that we ordered more, which we blatantly hadn't. It was obvious to me that the other reviews on TripAdvisor were fictitious, and I had once again unwittingly exposed his subterfuge. In the past, I've argued that Indonesia seems to attract the wrong type of expats, something Indonesian policymakers completely agree with me about, but their authoritarian response only makes the situation worse. I argued that maybe my observation that so many bullies I had met had been cheated out of their life savings almost as soon as their plane landed, turned them into fraudsters. Well, isn't this a description of narcissism and how people become narcissists? Expats arrive in Indonesia with high hopes, but realise that they need to become much harder to survive in the dog-eat-dog environment. There can be no trust between expats within Indonesia, as so many of them are now narcissists. Maybe the real reason is that so many expats arrive in Indonesia with baggage, which they foolishly believe will disappear when they arrive in Indonesia. Although there's also plenty of evidence that Indonesian companies targeted the wrong sort of expats to work in boiler room factories engaged in one of the world's biggest financial frauds. No wonder Indonesian politicians are so quick to condemn the expat community in Jakarta, as they're fully aware of their backgrounds and why they are in Indonesia. I appear to be arguing that narcissists are created, and certainly it's believed that they develop their behaviour as a result of neglect or trauma in childhood. But there are a number of suggestions that this can occur later in life. Maybe these are people already high on the narcissist scale who are pushed over the top by an event or circumstances. I know when I've been confronted by narcissists in business, I became more competitive while still retaining certain limits, popularly seen as business ethics. Is this the process which affects expats in Indonesia? If so, can it be reversed? If not, are we now in a dangerous stage of humanity where the conditions are creating more and more narcissists? After all, so much of my current understanding of the world comes from having considered Indonesia, the lack of business ethics, the manipulation of public opinion, and the callous disrespect for human life, which appear so apparent to someone who will regrettably never be accepted as Indonesian. Sam Vankin argues that yes, people can behave like narcissists, having been abused by one, but that this is reversible. But if they become narcissists, then it isn't. Now, thinking about my life, and in particular my working life, I realise that so much of it has been dominated by corporate sociopaths. Early on in my career, I was somewhat shielded from the worst effects of the sociopath. But as I progressed through the hierarchy, I was exposed to their chicanery. Whilst my first sales managers were nurturing, an approach I applied myself as a sales manager, later I kept coming across sales managers who, far from feeding me sales, would steal mine and with it my commission. Then there was my manager, an academic, who had used me and a colleague to write his academic papers, which resulted in him getting a chair and a fellowship of the Royal Academy. During this time, another gained membership of the Institute of Training and Development by claiming my work to be his. Before getting this job, I attended interviews at a series of new and somewhat minor business schools around the UK. For some reason, I was never offered a job, yet ended up with an offer from an established and top business school. I recall how the head of each business school was a complete sociopath. One had CCTV cameras installed in the room. Candidates relaxed and chatted together. Another made me sign a non-disclosure agreements before the interview could take place. My final job saw me again under the control of a narcissist. He seemed to me to be he could see in me something he lacked, but managed to completely destroy these attributes within me. He had spotted that I was good at public speaking and put me forward at every opportunity, often without being given time to prepare. Now, like all INFJs, anything I am good at is a result of meticulous preparation until I feel comfortable with the task in hand. So when my performances deteriorated, I was berated for it, rather than allowing me the preparation time I was asking for. As an INFJ, I cannot stand assessments, as all I want to do is please others. So once I'm told that I'm not, I'm completely deflated and confused, especially when it's the narcissist giving me the feedback. No wonder I eventually started my own business. It was not the pull of being my own boss, but the push from narcissistic bosses, which was the real impetus, a subconscious desire for no contact. When working in computer-based training, I went to visit a recruitment consultant who wanted to donate his knowledge of the industry to humanity. He felt that computer-based training might be an attractive vehicle for his generosity. He was something of a character, but I always see the good in people, It wasn't till back at the office when it was realised that his knowledge was dubious to say the least, and included gems like never hire a man in a purple tie because he's a homosexual. Another of his pearls was to place a plate of biscuits before the candidates with only one chocolate biscuit, and to hire the person who took the chocolate one, which of course almost certainly would have been the narcissist. Maybe there is a precedence within the industry, as I recall being savaged by someone from Nottingham Viper, the executive recruiters. The tyrant got it into his head that I'd lied on my CV, probably that it was I who was the psychopath, even claiming that I did not know Professor Pat, whom he claimed to know and would phone. I was so shocked at his behaviour. I just sat there and did not call his bluff, as I had Pat's number on me, which would have been the appropriate thing to do. I was worried about money at the time. After all, my partner was pregnant with Branwell, but not that worried. However, he opened my concerns up into a chasm, and I'm still amazed that I did not throw myself under a bus on leaving the interview. I kept the invitation to the interview from Nottingham Viper for many years, looking for an opportunity to expose him, but one never came, maybe until today. Whilst my generation no longer doff our caps, we were brought up to respect psychopaths and admire their abuse of power. I was taught that if I obeyed my orders and worked hard, I could rise to become somebody that was looked up to and respected. But I was also taught to obey the rules, not believe that they didn't apply to me. So how could I win against bullies and cheats? Every so often we're thrown a sacrifice, like Epstein, to provide the facade that life was fair and legitimate, and most of us bought it. In a previous episode, I mentioned how on meeting my ex-partner, we created a wonderful home for our family to be. But before it was completed, it was destroyed by a water ingress and ended up living in a building site for nearly 20 years. I never got full recompense. I blamed an old friend who is now dead, and it'd be wrong to speak ill of him. But it came to me that the managing director of the managing agents was a corporate sociopath. He lied and used every dirty trick to prevent us from getting our apartment repaired, undoubtedly painting the suspicion that we were in the wrong to subsequent managing agents. At the time, I blamed these events for the destruction of my family, and for sure it didn't help. He'd made many enemies within our complex, one taking him to a rental tribunal which I attended. He spoke to the tribunal and he told them barefaced lies. I was staggered. This was a court of law. He was committing perjury. The tribunal could see the shock on my face and asked me to explain, which I did, winning them over to our case. But there was only limited room to find in the residents' favour. Like the man from Nottingham Viper, I had wanted justice for some time. You may see this as a desire for retribution, but I now realise that it was simply me being an empath and truth seeker. My partner created a wonderful 50th birthday for me, a scene from my favourite film, Interview with a Vampire. Despite being fabulous, it was not really the party I would have chosen, and that was the point. In designing the set with the professionalism she had our home, she had upstaged me on my own birthday. But worse still, whenever I complained about anything, the effort she'd put into the set was used as a reminder of how ungrateful I was about everything. All the classic behaviour of the narcissist. As the dark night of the soul has progressed, I became aware of how much of my life has been manipulated and shaped by narcissists. Perhaps the biggest moment in my life, certainly in recent years, was my decision to leave the psychopathic abuse I was enduring and move to Indonesia. Now, I would not wish to argue that I have no free will, but fate brought my soulmate to me, and I kept returning to Indonesia to be with Made. The business trips to Indonesia, my second and third visits to the country, had been arranged by Professor Darwin, who I now have no doubt is a narcissist, maybe like my ex-partner, also a psychopath. I recall how he'd keep coming back to me with new ventures, baits, to keep feeding off my energy. The relationship only ended when it was fed back to him that I'd betrayed him. You see, I concluded that he was a confidence trickster, and after Oscar gave him a job, I let Oscar know. You see, my ex-partner had pushed me into my supernova, and I was seeking revenge on the professor. But there was no real malice intended. I simply wanted to warn Oscar not to fall for his subterfuge. But I now believe Oscar to be a narcissist, along with everyone else I encountered via the professor. Were these other super empaths in their supernova phase? Somehow I doubt it. Just lesser narcissists playing the same games with Professor Darwin as he had played with them. As a result of these revelations, I began contacting old friends from the past. This included two kings from Nigeria, whom I'd been at university with, but separately, one as an undergrad and the other as a postgrad. The one seemed very guarded with me, and I finally recalled how when I was completing my finals, I lost almost all my friends. I'd always believed that I was to blame for this. You see, during exam times, I tend to cut myself off to avoid the temptations of a social life and focus on my revision. I did so at the end of my final year. Indeed, I returned to Shrewsbury to my parents to revise. I did so at the end of my first year. Indeed, I did so. I returned to Shrewsbury to my parents to revise. But when I returned to my flat, I found that it had been wrecked by my friends. I was lucky not to get expelled from university and not to have to repay the repair bills. During my finals, I once again cut myself off from my former friends. But at the time, I became aware that some of the friends were not being entirely honest with each other and encouraging others to take time off, while secretly revising every hour they had available. I may have commented on this and caused offence, but do not recall anything malicious by me. Such withdrawals are typical behaviour of empaths. But there was one friend in particular who seemed to be taking my identity, applying for jobs in the area I'd been accepted onto a postgrad course to study. Now it was so long ago, I cannot be sure he was a narcissist, nor that I was his primary source. But it's clear to me that somebody had said something to everybody I knew, which provoked a reaction well beyond anything I'd done. The funding for that postgraduate course was scrapped, and I found a job. About a year later, there was a reunion of sorts, and my best friend from university took me, but I'd been sent to Tangerang Banton, Coventry, and was ignored. Now, whatever I may have done, there is no way that it justifies people being wary of me over 40 years later, despite me having spent my life suspecting that it was. Nor does it justify me in having lost my friends and memories from university. Maybe this did have a profound effect on me, as since then I have made friends and lost them as I reinvent myself. But now I feel the need to reach out to those from the past. Reflecting my past, I've always been quick to see the best in people, forgiving them for their failings. But at times of change, maybe I have experienced mini dark nights of the soul and understand how I've been manipulated in the past. Thus I move on. It's not my intention to lose all my friends, only those who've been revealed as manipulating me, as is typical of the empath. Or could this simply be a fairly healthy response to change and how I embrace it? Strangely, I have very strong feelings that it's related to karma and the learning that we must do in our lives, as once we have learnt a lesson, or failed to, and need to repeat it, its circumstances change, and with them we also need to. It seems terribly callous unless you completely accept the concept of karma, and that is only a few who we will keep on meeting, sometimes in different forms, who really matters in terms of our learning. You may well be asking yourselves, why has my life been dominated by psychopaths and narcissists? And why do I continue to stumble over them? I'm beginning to feel like those earnest American ladies who post about narcissists on YouTube and see a narcissist on every corner. Indeed, it seems to me that borrowing money with no intent to repay is the mark of a narcissist, and in this count at least I've been a serial victim. Thinking of Martin's reaction to repay me really does prove this point, as he wanted to explain to me that whatever my need for money, it was not as great as his. Indeed, thinking of my ex-partner and Branwell, it's obvious that they both believe that what is mine is theirs, to use exactly how they please, however badly it may affect me. You see, to a narcissist, they say no reason whatsoever to repay loans. Indeed, when people loan them money, they're only collecting what is rightfully theirs and get real pleasure from spending it. This is the reason why it's impossible to get a loan repaid without a real fight. Months later, I began to doubt Martin's story about the man who'd supposedly taken all his money. Martin surely isn't that stupid. Much more likely is that when he lost his eyesight and ability to earn money, he invented this man and his schemes as a mechanism for loaning money from all he knew. So I was simply the latest in a long line of people whom have been duped into giving money to this man who is hard on his luck, but also the owner of 3 expensive properties in Jakarta. The reason he is unable to repay my loan is that I am the last in a long line of people that he's borrowed money from. Now, this is the man who lectured anyone within earshot about religion and morals. This final observation means that I want no more to do with Martin. Whilst I do feel sorry for him, I must conclude that this is karma for his subterfuge. But maybe the real reason why my life has been dominated and indeed blighted by psychopaths and narcissists is that the universe is trying to tell me something. Is this my mission, to learn about narcissism and how to arrange society so that we can incorporate them but not allow them to wreak havoc? In fact, whilst traditionally narcissism was believed to affect less than 1% of the general population, newer research suggests it could be as high as 7%. Furthermore, this only describes those with narcissistic personality disorder. There will be more, maybe another 10%, who exhibit some narcissistic tendencies. And then we need to add at least 1% who are psychopaths. Not all narcissistic. Some time ago, I estimated that around 1 in 6 Indonesians potentially sought to harm me, and a number of psychopaths within the general population would seem to confirm this. Add to that, I am an empath, and therefore a prime target for psychopaths and narcissists, and only around 1% of the general population are empaths. Indeed, I have always stated that I love people for their faults, never realising that this meant that I believe I could bring out their good points, nor that this marked me out as a target. Furthermore, as a bule living in Indonesia, I'm in a minority of around 0.04%. These statistics alone should begin to shed light on my unfortunate experience with Indonesia, and emphasised that I should stop blaming Indonesia and the Indonesian character, as the only elements of this that are attributed to Indonesia are my minority status and maybe the widespread use of black magic. I've fallen into the trap of banding psychopaths and narcissists together, but they're not the same. Certainly a psychopath can be a narcissist, as was my ex-partner, but they don't have to be. Both, along with Machiavellism, form the dark triad of personalities in psychology. I say that she was both, but I really don't know. Whilst I do hold some relevant qualifications, I'm not a psychologist, and certainly not a psychiatrist. My real reason for using them almost interchangeably is that I've been describing the abuse of the psychopath and the narcissist and its impact on me and wider society. But their behaviour and motivation can be completely different. I've also implied that psychopaths are the most destructive, which isn't necessarily true. But if somebody is identified as a psychopath, then it is normally recognised as a mental illness, whereas narcissism is generally seen as a personality disorder. Indeed, there are a wide variety of narcissists, which for the reader who's interested, there's plenty to read on these types. No, nor do I wish to add to the industry that narcissism has become. No, my focus is on this behaviour comes from my explanation of how some people believe they have the right to abuse others, which stems from attempting to control me through black magic. Furthermore, such interactions appear to be increasing, as truth seems to have been completely dispensed with. It's business. But I refuse to simply go along with such subterfuge, and unfortunately seem to keep tripping over it. Indeed, there does appear to be evidence that the incidence is increasing rapidly and is not evenly distributed by country. This is a response to the increasing infantilization, neoteny of humanity. Of those countries I know well, Saudi Arabia is amongst the least empathetic, which comes as no surprise. The US is also low and Indonesia moderately low. However, in terms of narcissism, Russia is top, closely followed by the USA. There's plenty of evidence that narcissism is on the increase, and that this is particularly apparent amongst the young, maybe 20%. Is this a result of their consumption of social media with its narcissistic assumptions? More recently, Sam Vaknin has argued that malignant narcissism describes those under 35, that they have become emotional zombies with no real interest. He describes almost perfectly Branwell, and to a lesser degree Widati, in how they have no real emotions nor attention span beyond their mobile phones. That this generation almost completely avoid human relations, living their lives through Facebook and Instagram. Indeed, as I have found, the more we chase pleasure, the more unhappy we become. Or my heightened awareness related me to experiencing my dark night, and that I keep uncovering the truth behind attempted subterfuge. Now I'm beginning to spot the psychopath or narcissist, and finally know to walk away rather than being seduced by their silver tongues. Indeed, not falling for the realities constructed by the psychopath, and that includes not listening to the news, is an essential part of living within the light. Is this the real meaning of life? Or at least, or my life at least? Sam Vaknin has described narcissism and its exponential rise as a virus epidemic, and that my spotting narcissists everywhere is my own immune system developing to them. He also identifies the mutation of narcissism to create new variants and how these are impacting on society. I have in the past argued that there's a strong relationship between virus and jinn. Maybe that viruses actually are jinn. He argues that narcissists develop to become covert narcissists as a result of this mutation, that narcissism eventually changes the very personality of its host. This would suggest that narcissism is beginning to shift, so it is more difficult to detect and protect against, particularly within society. Now I'm much more inclined to see gin as a metaphor for something which occurs within the mind, which appears to have an external trigger. But whatever we believe about viruses and gin, it does feel as though within my dark night of the soul, I'm being led to understand the influence of narcissism on humanity. If this was my mission, then in walking away from my ex-partner and turning my back on others, I'm beginning to break the karmic cycle. For once the psychopath experiences true rejection and failure, it is possible that there is a life lesson, not necessarily in this life, but the lesson will be learnt and the karma paid. Now, I'm not saying that the grief that has been reported to me about my ex-partner is real. No, it is simply more manipulation and pity-seeking. But such karma builds up over the generations. By believing and trusting myself again, without the need for narcissistic validation, I break their reality. Could the same be true for world events? Indeed, the lesson is not learnt by the psychopath, but you. For once we understand we must stop feeding the psychopath, a little of their hegemonic control is destroyed, and our universe changes. This contrasts with the interpretation Branwell has fed to me, but I must understand that he too is a psychopath, and simply taking every opportunity to control me. I must resist the ego-inspired desire to inflate my actions. Indeed, one never can be sure of anything with a psychopath. But the obverse is true of the psychopath or narcissist, for they're locked within their karma. I have said before that the rich are never happy with their wealth because their greed is unsatiable. But if we extrapolate this to narcissism, then we realise they can never be happy. For like a vampire, they must feed on the emotions of others. Their life is a constant search for energy. They are aware how they harm people and how others see them, but unable to overcome their karma. They're imprisoned with their own impulses, their low self-esteem and hurting from the damage which made them narcissists. This is the important reason for us victims to forgive and not seek the revenge. For simply disengaging is more than enough. Ideally, we could find a better solution, but karma means this is the only solution. Sam Vaknin, however, is more optimistic and believes that society can develop herd immunity towards narcissism and that we have become less susceptible to our own narcissistic tendencies. However, he does warn that narcissism will mutate towards the more dangerous psychopathy. Indeed, whilst I previously believed that I was codependent to my mother's narcissism, I'm beginning to understand that I'm actually a super empath, or at least at times behave as one. My years of abuse at the hands of my psychopathic ex-partner ultimately brought out my own narcissistic traits. This was the beginning of my evolution from abuse. Yes, I did behave badly at the end of our relationship, and this was me mirroring the behaviour of my ex-partner, known as the supernova. This was not me attempting to destroy the psychopath, simply a defence mechanism which became increasingly strident, as opposed to completely succumbing to alcoholism and despair, as my ex-partner's husband had. The result was disastrous, resulting in a totally dysfunctional relationship with my ex-partner, eventually throwing me out of my own home, as she eventually realised that I was no longer in her control, or maybe that was her plan all along. So eventually the narcissists collided. But maybe this is where the karma was actually taking me. I do, however, need to warn you, dear reader, as one very good way to spot when someone is not actually an empath is that they tell others that they are. I hope my reason for claiming to be an empath is to expand my yarn, but once again I must consider it is I who is actually engaged in narcissistic subterfuge. As always, Thomas Sheridan is succinct in describing this by stating that people who claim to be empaths are evil as it's part of their controlling behaviour. Like narcissism, there is an industry of people providing advice on empaths, especially amongst New Agers. This leads to the incorrectly labelling of the rest of the population as narcissists, which, yes, I've been guilty of, ultimately placing those claiming to be empaths deeper into the abyss, which is the self. There is a theory that the childhood trauma which creates narcissists and empaths are the same. That empathy is an adaptation to the reaction to these traumas and not the current external stimuli. Yes, an empath may pick up on the pain and malice of others, but the real cause is within the empath's development. Indeed, the difference between the narcissist and the empath is in their adaptation to this childhood reaction, which is why they seem to be on the same scale, whereby empaths give energy and narcissists take it, rather than binary opposites. Maybe the supernova is a result of the empath taking on the characteristics of the narcissist for so long. This is done through empathy in the same way as many begin to mimic another's accent. Could this be the reason why these two very distinct personality types, that they neutralise each other? That despite psychologists insisting that narcissists cannot be changed, that there can be a gradual exchange of traits until neither the narcissist nor the empath are so obvious. Indeed, if you look at each of the episodes, they reveal a change in my attitudes, from accepting that I was every bit as responsible for the destruction of our family, to a realisation that I was being manipulated and the victim. Yes, I was constantly provoked to react, often violently, but I never did. I largely ignored these provocations, but slowly sunk into despair and confusion. So the supernova was a simple defence mechanism, not a desire for revenge, although at certain times revenge did seem attractive. After nearly 20 years of celibacy, my infidelity certainly felt like just dessert, and I certainly did want to hurt my ex-partner as much as I then believed she'd hurt me. But maybe I never could. Perhaps my supernova occurred much earlier, as I really withdrew from our relationship and threw myself into work and business when my partner became pregnant and refused to have bleep with me. For years I was able to put up with a degree of abuse, as I had other things on my mind. This would explain why holidays were always so painful, as it was the one time that my partner had me to herself. Then when my business started to fail, it became obvious that my partner no longer saw me as a source, and I had nowhere to hide. Although of course my trips to Indonesia to be with Made just about did provide me with enough distance to maintain the sham of a relationship for a further 5 years, with me worrying, believing that this was in Branwell's best interest. Well, maybe it was, but I had no idea how damaged he already was. Now, if I am correct that my ex-partner had been cheating on me, could my own unfaithfulness be about karma? Although there is one element of my own narcissism which I believe came from my mother, and that is a degree of infidelity. As I have said, I've always attempted to treat women with respect, but there have been periods in my life when I've behaved as a playboy. Nevertheless, I've attempted to avoid deliberately misleading women, and so probably would not be considered a narcissistic player. Certainly I've never attempted to control those women in a narcissistic way. But I think the real impact was that even when I had a stable relationship, my mother would encourage me to play the field. She would tell me that I was too young to be tied down to my partner, and that this normally would be followed by something of a character assassination of my partner. I'd always felt that my mother had attempted to destroy any relationship I ever had, including her behaviour when I introduced Maddie to her. But it now makes perfect sense, because my mother saw in other females as competing with her for my fuel. Furthermore, casual sex is the ultimate narcissistic activity, believing that it doesn't matter and nobody is getting hurt. But you are hurting both the girls and yourself in believing that such intimacy can be casual and turned off and on. But then again, I've had 2 periods of leading a hedonistic lifestyle, taking risks and not caring if I lived or died. The first was when I was young and at school, and the second after I decided that my relationship with my ex-partner was over. Whilst I have to take responsibility for my actions, and I may have hurt on my mission, could it be that both cases these were me attempting to escape from narcissistic control? Were my excesses a lost soul looking for a reason to live and believing that I had found it in short-term gratification? Or more likely, these were my supernova breaking away first from my mother and then my ex-partner? I remember as a teenager feeling as though something had exploded inside me, and though this was an explosion of testosterone on the young body, which undoubtedly it was, but I now believe it was also my supernova. It is a feature of narcissistic abuse that one begins to doubt one's own mental health. That is what you hear and witness has actually happened. You're so sensitive. I don't know what you're talking about. You're lying. This is common as a result of their splitting and gaslighting behaviour. But one area which has really impacted on me was the doubt that it was I who was actually the narcissist. You see, long before I discovered that my mother and ex-partner were a narcissist and a psychopath, I was aware that a sign of either is a lack of empathy. But my ex-partner had learnt the behaviour of normal people when empathy was required. Indeed, she exhibited selective empathy. She even used her mother's death to launch another victim fantasy by crying for over a year when anyone was around to hear. Babies cry to get their needs met. Narcissists are great actors and often do use tears as a tool of manipulation, but this is an abuse tactic. Do not allow them to let this work as guilt. They're acting. Tracy Malone. But when I'm faced with a similar bereavement, I'm stoical, at least until my role as a bedrock is over, just as my father was. So this made me think that maybe it was I who was the narcissist, and my partner was right in her condemnation of my character, particularly my desire to distance myself from another, which I now understand was a very sensible reaction. However, the very fact that I'm even concerned about this means that it cannot be true. The way I go over these events in my mind, thinking I could have approached it better, are classic signs of an empath, even accepting part responsibility for the failures of relationships with narcissists. Indeed, my last 3 episodes have explored my guilt over the mess I've made of my life, but I must now realise and find the love for myself in order for me to love humanity. Nevertheless, there are a few learned behaviours and phrases that I use that do indicate that I inherited some narcissism from my mother. If I am correct that my super empath gave way to narcissism, my previous 3 episodes have also been about me once again suppressing my narcissistic tendencies or my ego. I arrived in Indonesia, a narcissist to run into further conflicts which set back my recovery. This is the baggage which so many expats arrive in Indonesia with. The light that I've now found is me finding my true empathetic self once more. That I can move from empath to super empath to narcissist also explains so much about my life to date. How I have attracted success through my empathy, but become consumed with pride before a fall. I've also enjoyed success through my narcissistic actions and found them to be wanting. My dark night of the soul is therefore about releasing my bad behaviour to myself, but I now have the knowledge to forgive myself whilst keep guarding that I do not repeat my mistakes. At a simple level, you may see this as indicative how a person rises to a challenge and competition, but I've always known that I don't respond well to excessive challenge and competition, as I know that it brings out the worst in me. Once again, we can extrapolate this to wider society and urge that not only is greed bad, but so too is excessive competition and pressure. Strangely, there appears to be a neurological explanation as to why power makes those who have it drunk on it, becoming narcissists and taking risks which lead to their downfall. Research at the University of California, Berkeley and McMaster University in Canada. Strangely, I can find no reference to a McMaster who illustrated mucky postcards. Maybe they were only available in Canada, has found that power causes changes similar to brain damage. Indeed, people who gain power lose the traits which brought them to a power and exhibit much less agreeable behaviour. When I first met Maddie, I saw in her the same as every man, somebody I could exploit. So it was my temporary slip into narcissism which brought Maddie and I together. It was not simply that I needed time away from my ex-partner to heal, but I needed time with another empath. This puts a further spin on Maddie's breakdown and our subsequent enlightening. During Maddie's dramatic dark night, she even saw many of the betrayals to me, and now I'm only beginning to understand. She even offered to show me the truth about my relationship, but I was too busy trying to help Maddie and dealing with all that was happening. You see, without Maddie becoming dependent on me, we may never have established the true empath relationship. Without me seeking to understand what was happening to Maddie, it may have taken much longer for me to begin my own dark night of the soul, which has brought me to the light. This guide, this light, brighter than the midday sun, lead me to the waiting one. I know so well my delight to place with none in sight. St. John of the Cross, the dark night. But it isn't just about me. Why would it be? No, if the numbers of narcissists are increasing and psychopathic assumptions have infiltrated our every institution and way of working, does this not explain the situation that the world finds itself in? Everything has become corrupted and there is nothing we can trust anymore. I include in this religious institutions, as where better for a narcissist to hide. Indeed, this explains the increase in the promotion of evangelical religious beliefs, often mixed with intolerance and hatred. This is so pervasive that even God becomes the psychopath, the Old Testament God of Martin's imagination, and they find succour within the scriptures which confirms that they are special and that they are designed in God's image, which is why we allow narcissists to destroy everything we hold dear, everything God blessed us with. Please don't answer human nature, because it's a part of the very hegemony that has encouraged all of this to happen. What we call religion is merely organised belief within the dogmas, rituals, mysteries and superstitions. Each religion has its own sacred book, its mediator, its priests, its ways of threatening and holding people, Most of us have been conditioned to all of this, which is considered religious education. But this conditioning sets man against man. It creates antagonism, not only amongst the believers, but also against those of other beliefs. Though all religions assert they worship God and say we must love one another, they instill fear through their doctrines of reward and punishment, and through their competitive dogmas they perpetuate suspicion and antagonism. Jindal Krishnamurti. It's not only psychopaths and narcissists in position of power that have destroyed our institutions, for the number of narcissist service users is increasing, then maybe the assumptions increasingly made by service providers is coming true. I only have to look at the disproportionate amount of health and social care resources my own mother has demanded to realise the destructive effect of a few on the system, which is based on the assumption of scarcity. The reaction is to ration services to all, when the honest reaction would have been to build self-reliance. So there is currently much more talk of universal basic income, while individuals are forfeiting their assets and ability to provide for themselves, making them dependent on the behemoth that the state has become. But the state, its leaders and functionaries, are every bit as destroyed by the narcissism and greed as in part of society. The local has been destroyed in ever-increasing pressures to centralise, supposedly to save money, despite the senior managers' wages increase exponentially. But decisions have been deferred to experts, and there is no longer any real management nor leadership, leaving only corruption and greed which drives the public sector. When the narrative we are fed is that in removing authority and local decision making, we're moving the opportunities for corruption. The reality is that corruption has become big business, and those offering incentives no longer want to deal with a myriad of local officials. But service users are dissatisfied with the services they receive, and those frontline workers who still have jobs now hate their jobs, indulging in hedonism to forget their loss of satisfaction. Indeed, for the majority, work is now something people see as a duty, not a joy. Isn't this because of the psychopathic assumptions behind the regulations we are placed under? This is especially true for those working in customer service, which is now a tautology. There's no longer any commitment whatsoever to satisfying customers. Indeed, like in Indonesia, customers are a nuisance, getting in the way of psychopaths building empires within organisations. Ask yourself this: if customer service really mattered, would we offshore it to India? Undoubtedly, the same is true for software development, especially for banks. Now, I'm not blaming politicians for a lack of conviction and having been bought off by powerful interests. But in this world of regulation, what real power have they been left with? Fearful that politicians are untrustworthy and illogical as their electorates. Like their electorates, they too have been neutered. Decisions are actually deferred to experts through a series of bureaucratic agencies and instruments, based on the assumptions that there are best and sensible options for humanity, devoid of politics and common sense. That expert opinion is more important than the will of the people. The triumph of the left brain over the right, of science over religion, of rationality over feelings. But who are these experts? They're the bankers, hedge fund managers, economists, psychologists, bioengineers, drug company executives, the surveillance capitalists. And more importantly, is it really us that they serve? In short, they are those on the guest list at Little St. James. Our only option is to rebuild society and human knowledge from the bottom up, as unwittingly I began when I moved to the mountain. Of course, my move to the mountain was thrust upon us, as was the depletion of my wealth. I did not choose a simple life of limited consumption. I was forced into it, as indeed are so many people in this increasingly cruel world. But what it does do is put me at the vanguard of a new social revolution, a social revolution created by the greed of capitalist organisations which contain the seeds of destruction of capitalism. For our entire economic systems are dependent on everyone to increase their consumption, but a growing number are turning their backs on this consumption. So will the existing economic system simply crumble? Of course not. There will be major social and economic upheaval, maybe even wars, to force us to consume when we have lost the ability to consume. But we are left with a greater problem. If over 1 in 6 people are narcissists, how do we accommodate them within a new Jerusalem? How do we build a society without narcissists as politicians, business leaders, religious leaders, judges, generals, etc.? Maybe the only way is to build a society without hierarchy and authority, without a meritocracy. To build a society in which the assumption is God's abundance and love, and not scarcity and greed. To build a society in which we are in touch with and rely on our own feelings, rather than on what others tell us to believe. The difference between political terror and ordinary crime becomes clear during the change of regimes, in which the former terrorists become well-regarded representatives of their country. Jürgen Habermas. But even this vignette on society is an oversimplification, for the real experts are not human, but the algorithms developed by neural networks which now run our lives. True, the underlying assumptions behind these algorithms may well reflect the views of those on the guest list at Little St. James, but these ideas have been allowed to run riot on all the data in the world, in the belief that society is too complex. Nobody understands, nobody questions these algorithms, nor if we actually want them, as we are mesmerised by the patterns they have uncovered, patterns which make those on the guest list richer and the rest of us even poorer. But this is one pattern that is never vocalised explicitly. Perhaps there's a further stage to which I must embrace in my own recovery, and that is to stop seeing myself as victim and others as aggressors. It is true that I have been victimised by some psychopaths and narcissists, and that the majority of the population do not share my empathetic perspective. But I am in danger of seeing everything in the world as aggressors and victims, or narcissists and empaths. I need to embrace the world as it is, not perfect, but not constantly conspiring against me. The observant reader will have spotted an example of the Mandela effect. The name of the film is actually Interview with the Vampire, despite almost everyone believing it to be Interview with a Vampire. Well, that concludes this chapter from my 4th book, The Phoenix and the Creatures of Darkness, and it's actually the final in this series of books. I'm not saying I won't write another book, but I feel this series is now complete. I really hoped you enjoyed it. And now I'm going to add a new chapter every week to this book. So if you want to hear about it, subscribe and hit the bell. Now, I'm not doing particularly well with these eBay. YouTube algorithms. So if you could hit the like button and make some comments, I think it helps me. I hate to ask you for this. I hate it when I hear people coming out with this sort of statement. But the truth is that this has been like a full-time job for the last 4 years of my life. And I'm still a long way off from receiving any money whatsoever for it. So I really do need to, I suppose, beg you. Subscribe, like, make comments. And thank you very much. Thanks.